Hello students, Dr. Benson here. Instead of attending BioSci 102 in our regular classroom on Monday, March 21st, you're viewing the lecture here as this enhanced podcast. Today's lecture continues from the Friday before spring break into Chapter 22, which covers the structures and function of the digestive system. Before you begin, remember that for participation points for this lecture, you'll need to store answers to the clicker questions embedded in today's lecture. So if you're not sure how to use your clicker to store your answers, go to your user's manual and review how to enter answers in homework mode. Basically, you can enter answers and save them for sending all at once in a special session I'll start when we meet on Wednesday at the beginning of class. If you don't have a user's manual, go to Blackboard and download the instructions I've posted there under General Documents. So let's review just a little bit before getting into today's material. Last lecture, I detailed the 4 steps that accomplish the work of processing your food. You first ingest your food, and because your body can't use food in the form as it exists on your plate, it has to be digested, which is the dismantling of bites of food into very small molecules, which can then be absorbed by specialized cells of the digestive system. What your body doesn't break down and use, which is largely cellulose from plant tissue that your body isn't able to digest, is then eliminated. Did you catch the 4 steps of food processing? If not, rewind and listen for them again. The processing of food then depends on mechanical and chemical digestion. Mechanical digestion occurs by physical processes such as chewing in the mouth and churning in the stomach. Chemical digestion occurs by the reaction that uses water. Do you remember which reaction uses water to break molecules? This reaction, the hydrolysis reaction, is facilitated by enzymes that are produced and secreted by what are known as accessory organs. So the digestive system consists of a set of organs that are the primary organs that accomplish these tasks of food processing, but also accessory organs that their primary digestive function is to secrete enzymes. We started to look at the functional components of the digestive system last lecture, and we'll pick up there. Pay close attention as we continue looking at the parts of the digestive system so that you can say where mechanical and chemical digestion both occur, or where molecules are absorbed, or where waste is eliminated. And so for our Wednesday lecture after spring break, we'll finish up Chapter 22 and learn about nutrition. Okay, so recall that the human digestive system, also referred to as the alimentary canal, is made up of several organs, shown on the right here, and also a set of accessory organs. Before we go on though, answer this first clicker question that tests what you remember about the accessory organs. This is a multiple choice question, so simply enter your answer into your clicker and store it for question 1. Last lecture, I described the structure and function of the mouth and salivary glands, the pharynx, and the esophagus. We'll continue today by starting with the stomach. Before we go on though, here's another clicker question for you. This is a true or false question that asks about the structure of the pharynx. Go ahead and pause the podcast while you think about this question and enter your answer. And when you finish, we'll continue lecture by taking a look at the structure and the function of the stomach. Okay, let's move ahead now, and we're going to start with the stomach, taking a look at its structure and also its function. The stomach is structured with an interior that's made up of extensively folded tissue. Here in figure 22.9, you can see that where it looks sort of like hills and valleys, like the interior of the stomach is made up of hills and valleys. Because the lining of the stomach is folded like this, it can expand greatly when you eat a meal. And in fact, it can hold as much as 2 liters of food and fluid, which is the equivalent of a half a gallon of milk. So, the first function of the stomach then is to store food. This way we don't have to constantly eat. Instead, you can eat a large meal and then slowly digest that meal over a period of several hours. The second and perhaps more prominent function of the stomach is digestion, both chemical and mechanical digestion. The stomach makes and secretes gastric juice. One quality of gastric juice is that it has a very low pH because it's made up largely of hydrochloric acid. A second quality is that it's loaded with enzymes, especially those that target proteins. Gastric juice facilitates chemical digestion in a couple of ways. First, the acidity helps to break the bonds of chemicals in the plant and animal tissue of the food that you've eaten. But more importantly, the acidity of gastric juice works to break down proteins in particular by denaturing them. Remember that proteins are sensitive to pH. The low pH of the gastric juice changes the shape of the proteins. As a result, proteins are then more susceptible to hydrolysis, which in the stomach is facilitated by the enzyme pepsin. You might wonder why pepsin, which as an enzyme is a protein, isn't affected by the low pH of the stomach. Because didn't I just say that the low pH of the stomach is bad for proteins? Well, in fact, pepsin works best at low pH. It doesn't do as good a job when pH increases. The low pH of the gastric juice also has a non-digestive benefit, which is that it creates an inhospitable environment for any bad bacteria and at the bottom of your body if you've eaten contaminated. Do you remember what these little structures are, how they're constructed, and what their functions are in the body? So a sphincter is a little ring of muscle that tends to stay contracted, and as such, keep sections of the digestive system separate. So the sphincter at the top of the stomach and the one at the bottom of the stomach then effectively compartmentalize the stomach and contain the gastric juice. The stomach itself is in fact susceptible to self-digestion because of the low pH of the gastric juice. So the cells of the tissue that line the stomach secrete a protective mucus, which helps to protect against self-digestion. The production of gastric juice is controlled, and it is secreted only when food enters the stomach. As food is digested and leaves the stomach, gastric juice production slows down or stops until food again enters the stomach. Think of gastric juice level in the stomach as a process under one of the feedback mechanisms that you've learned about this semester. Would you say this process was under positive or negative feedback? This is the third clicker question for today's lecture. Take a minute here to enter an answer, 1 for positive, 2 for negative, into your clicker. The combined effect of chemical and mechanical digestion is that food is turned into what is called chyme, which, like the gastric juice of the stomach, is very acidic. It's chyme that moves on to the next compartment of the alimentary canal. Before we move on to the next part of the digestive system, let's talk just a minute about some ailments of the stomach that are related to the acidity of the gastric juice of the stomach. As mentioned before, the sphincters serve to keep the contents of the stomach contained until released at the right time. The esophageal sphincter, which is the one that separates the esophagus and the stomach, may not close perfectly though because of an injury, a condition of the body such as obesity or pregnancy, or because of some medications. If it doesn't close perfectly, then food and liquid that's mixed with gastric juice can leak back up into the esophagus. This causes what is known as heartburn, and more chronically, acid reflux. Chronic acid reflux can cause damage to the esophagus, such as bleeding, inflammation, or a narrowing of the esophagus, and so should be controlled. In the stomach, if mucus production is compromised, gastric juice may contact the sensitive tissue lining the stomach and cause damage. Very severe cases can lead to holes in the stomach, which are called ulcers. Untreated ulcers can lead to internal bleeding or infection. It was originally thought that ulcers were brought on by stress or chronic worrying, but we now know that more than half of all ulcers of the stomach are caused by bacteria that damage the mucus. Figure 22.10 in your book shows mucus-producing cells of the stomach infected with Helicobacter pylori, the name of the bacterium that infects the stomach. The infection can be cured with a combination of antibiotics and other drugs that reduce stomach acid and then protect the lining of the stomach. Chronic use of some kinds of over-the-counter medications can also lead to ulcers. For instance, ibuprofen and aspirin, if taken too much, can interfere with production of the protective mucus, which then leaves the sensitive tissue of the stomach susceptible to damage from the gastric juice. Okay, so let's move on to the next part of the alimentary canal. So the product of the stomach is acid chyme. Chyme is released from the stomach in small spurts into the next compartment of the alimentary canal, which is the small intestine. Figure 22.5 here is pointing to this very long, narrow tube, which is surrounded by the large intestine. You can see the difference in size between the large and the small intestine, which explains why we call them large and small. The small intestine is smaller in diameter than the large intestine. The small intestine is the longest part of the alimentary canal, and if we were to remove it from the body and stretch it out, it would stretch to over 20 feet in length. Think of how tall you are, somewhere between 5 and 6 feet. The small intestine is the length of 3 or 4 of you, laid out head to toe. All this length fits into the small volume of your abdominal cavity because it's folded back and forth onto itself. The small intestine is divided into specialized regions. For our purposes, we'll divide the small intestine into 2 regions. The first foot, which is called the duodenum, and then the rest of the small intestine. The function of the duodenum is to complete digestion of your food. In this part of the digestive system, biological molecules that remain after the mechanical and chemical digestion that occurred in the mouth and in the stomach are completely chemically digested into monomers, so they can actually enter the body by absorption farther in the small intestine. It is here that the rest of the accessory organs are involved in food processing. These accessory organs include the pancreas and the liver, which works with the gallbladder. Let's talk very specifically about these accessory organs. First, the pancreas and the liver are multifunctional. That means that even though they have digestive functions, they have other functions in the body as well. Here we're just going to talk about their digestive functions. So the duodenum receives chyme from the stomach. Remember that chyme is very acidic, which could be damaging to the rest of the digestive system. So the first order of business in the duodenum is to neutralize the chyme, that is, bring up its pH. The pancreas then secretes chemicals that do in fact neutralize the chyme so that it doesn't damage the tissue of the small intestine. The fluid of the pancreas also contains a variety of enzymes, specifically hydrolases, that are used to complete chemical digestion of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats in the chyme. We'll look at these enzymes more closely in a minute. Let's look at the function of the liver. The liver secretes a compound called bile, which helps to digest fats and only fats. The liver produces bile, but then bile is stored in the gallbladder. That's how the liver and the gallbladder work together. So bile enters the duodenum from the gallbladder. The need for bile is this. If you remember, fats are big molecules that are hydrophobic. As a consequence, they're not easily broken down by the hydrolysis reaction. The function of bile is to break down big fat molecules into smaller molecules, which also serves to increase the surface area of the molecules. And then those molecules are then digested with the help of enzymes. The process of breaking down fats into smaller molecules is called emulsification.